The coordinates had been buried in a fragment of corrupted data that no one should have been able to read, but Dr. Cassian Vael could read things that no one should have been able to read. It was the talent that had made his career and destroyed his reputation in roughly equal measure, the ability to recognize patterns in noise that other analysts dismissed as static. His colleagues at the Confederate Archaeological Bureau called him obsessive. His ex-wife called him impossible. His former department head had called him fired, which was how Cassian had ended up on a privately funded survey vessel crawling through the ruins of a dead star system on the far side of the galactic frontier. The system had no official name. It appeared in navigational databases as a blank coordinate, one of thousands of empty patches on the map where no one had ever found anything worth mapping. Cassian had come here because the corrupted data fragment, which he had extracted from a stolen pre-consolidation archive 7 years ago, contained a reference to this location that was encoded in a cipher that had taken him 4 years to break. The reference was a single word: Shipyard. The system contained a brown dwarf, a failed star that glowed with a dim reddish light and was orbited by a thin scattering of rocky bodies that were too small to be planets and too large to be asteroids. It was the kind of system that existed only as a footnote, a place that the galaxy had made and then forgotten. But when the survey vessel's sensors swept the brown dwarf's orbital space, they found something that the galaxy had not forgotten. A structure, not a natural formation. A constructed object roughly 1,200 kilometers in length, orbiting the brown dwarf at a distance of 2 million kilometers. The structure was a ring, a massive torus of dark material that encircled the star like a halo, and the survey vessel's sensors detected regular geometric subdivisions within the ring that were consistent with enclosed spaces of a size that could accommodate large vessels. Cassian stared at the sensor display and felt the particular sensation that had driven his entire career, the tightening in his chest that occurred when the universe revealed a corner of itself that no one had seen before. The structure was a shipyard, an orbital shipyard built around a star large enough to service vessels of considerable size, and it was old. The brown dwarf's orbital mechanics allowed for an estimation of the structure's age based on the accumulated radiation damage to its outer surface, and the number that the survey vessel's computer produced was one that made Cassian grip the edge of his console until his knuckles ached. Roughly 18,000 years. Cassian was still staring at the display when the ship's captain, a Valyrian named Thessaly Ven Korith, came to stand beside him. Her iridescent skin shifted to a pale gold, the color that Cassian had learned to associate with her version of careful attention. "That is not a natural formation," she said. "No, and it is not a Confederate structure. No, the design language is unfamiliar to me, but you are staring at it as if it is familiar to you." Cassian pulled up the corrupted data fragment on a secondary display. The cipher he had broken had translated the word shipyard, but the surrounding data contained structural references that he had never been able to fully decode. Now, looking at the sensor image of the ring around the brown dwarf, pieces of those references began to align. "It's human," he said. "Pre-consolidation. The overall configuration is consistent with theoretical models of human orbital industry from the ascendancy period, roughly 18 to 20,000 years before the present. The models are speculative because no physical evidence of ascendancy-era orbital infrastructure has ever been found, until now." Thessaly's skin shifted to a deeper gold. A human shipyard, 18,000 years old, in a system that does not appear on any map. "Oh yes, there will be regulations about this. Almost certainly. And you will want to ignore them." Cassian looked at her. "I will want to see what's inside it first, then I will decide which regulations to ignore." Thessaly was quiet for several seconds. Valyrians processed ethical calculations differently than humans, weighing the long-term consequences of actions against their immediate benefits with a thoroughness that could be paralyzing. But she had been working with Cassian for 3 years, and she had learned that his obsessions, while frequently reckless, were rarely wrong. "Take us closer," she said. The survey vessel approached the ring at a cautious quarter impulse. As the distance closed, the structure resolved from a geometric abstraction into a tangible presence that filled the forward viewport and pressed against the mind with a weight that was almost physical. The ring was not a single continuous structure, but a series of connected modules, each one roughly 40 kilometers in length and 10 kilometers in width, linked by massive truss segments that span the gaps between them. The modules were enclosed, their outer surfaces covered in a dark, slightly iridescent material that absorbed the survey vessel's scanning frequencies and returned only the faintest echoes. The ring was damaged. Several of the modules were fractured, their interiors exposed to space, and the truss connections between some sections had broken, leaving gaps in the ring where modules had drifted away from their positions and now orbited the brown dwarf independently. The damage was not recent. The fracture surfaces had the same radiation-weathered texture as the rest of the structure, suggesting that the destruction had occurred at roughly the same time as the shipyard's abandonment. But the modules that were intact were not just intact, they were active. Cassian's sensors detected a faint energy signature emanating from the interior of the intact modules, a low-level power output that was consistent with systems running in a standby state. After 18,000 years, something inside the shipyard was still running. "Thessaly, I'm reading power signatures from at least 30 of the intact modules. The energy output is minimal, but it's there. The shipyard has active systems." Thessaly's skin shifted to a color that Cassian had never seen before. A deep amber with veins of white that he suspected was the Valyrian equivalent of a controlled adrenaline surge. "That is not possible. Nothing maintains power for 18,000 years. The power source is not identifiable. The energy signature doesn't match any known generation technology, but it's there." Thessaly studied the sensor data for a long time. Then she turned to the helmsman. "Take us to the nearest intact module, approach the surface at minimum speed, prepare the shuttle for launch." "Captain," the helmsman said, a young Torsen whose large frame looked awkwardly compressed in the standard-issue seat, "we should report this to the Bureau before approaching. By the time the Bureau receives our report and dispatches a team, we will have been here for months. We are here now, we have sensors, we have a shuttle. We will conduct a preliminary assessment and report our findings along with the data. That is not ignoring regulations. It is gathering information that will make the regulations more informed." The Torsen nodded, unconvinced but obedient, and the survey vessel moved toward the nearest intact module. The module's outer surface was a wall of dark material that filled the viewport as the ship approached. A surface so large and so uniform that it was difficult to perceive as an object rather than a featureless extension of space itself. The iridescent quality that Cassian had noticed at a distance was more pronounced up close, a subtle shimmer that moved across the surface like light on water, and his sensors detected a faint electromagnetic field surrounding the module that pulsed with a regularity that was almost organic. They found an opening. A section of the module's outer wall had a different texture than the surrounding surface, smoother and slightly recessed, and when the survey vessel's sensors probed it, the section retracted, sliding aside with a smoothness that was deeply unsettling in something that had not moved in 18 millennia. The opening was a bay, a large enclosed space that was pressurized and lit by the same faint shimmer that covered the exterior. "Pressurized bay," the helmsman reported, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a person who was encountering something that exceeded his capacity to process. "Atmosphere is 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen. Temperature is 19 degrees Celsius. The shipyard is maintaining a habitable environment," Cassian said, "inside modules that have been abandoned for 18,000 years. Something is maintaining it, Thessaly corrected, and that something is still here. If you're finding this as compelling as I hoped, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I really want to hear what you think is waiting inside those modules, so drop your best guesses in the comments below. Now, back to the story. Cassian and Thessaly took the shuttle. The helmsman and the ship's engineer remained on the survey vessel, maintaining position and monitoring the approach. The shuttle crossed the bay and settled on a deck that was marked with the same preconsolidation human script that Cassian had seen in the archive fragments, directional signs and system labels that his translator could partially decode. The bay was empty of craft but not empty of detail. The walls were lined with maintenance equipment that was dark but intact, and the floor was clean, free of the dust and debris that should have accumulated over 18 millennia. They exited the shuttle in EVA suits, a precaution that Thessaly had insisted on despite the breathable atmosphere. Cassian agreed with the precaution not because he expected danger, but because the alternative, stepping into an 18,000-year-old structure in his shirt sleeves, felt like a violation of a boundary that existed for good reasons, even if he couldn't articulate what those reasons were. The interior corridor beyond the bay was wide and straight, designed for a scale of operations that dwarfed anything in the modern Confederation. The ceiling was high enough to accommodate heavy cargo transport vehicles, and the walls were marked with signs that directed traffic to various sections of the module. Cassian followed the signs toward the section labeled Construction Oversight, which his archive research suggested would be the command and control center of the module. The corridor opened into a chamber that stopped Cassian in his tracks. It was a vast space, roughly circular, with a ceiling that arched overhead in a dome covered in the same shimmering material that coated the exterior. The dome glowed with a soft, warm light that filled the chamber with an illumination that felt natural rather than artificial, like sunlight filtered through a canopy. The center of the chamber was dominated by a large holographic display table that was active, projecting a three-dimensional image of the entire shipyard ring, with each module rendered in detail and labeled with designations that Cassian's translator struggled to decode. The display showed the ring in its current state. 34 modules were highlighted in amber, indicating active status. 12 were highlighted in red, indicating damaged or offline status. And within each of the amber highlighted modules, the display showed smaller shapes. Vessels, dozens of them, hundreds of them. Thessaly, Cassian said, his voice barely above a whisper inside his helmet. Look at the display. Thessaly was already looking. Her skin had gone a deep, steady blue that Cassian associated with intense analytical focus. The active modules contain vessels, she said. I count 743 individual contacts across the 34 active modules. The size distribution ranges from small escort-class vessels to what appear to be capital ships. All are showing the same minimal power signature that we detected from outside the ring. 743 ships, inside an 18,000-year-old shipyard, still powered. Oh yes. Cassian approached the display table. The holographic image was sharp and detailed, rendering each vessel with a clarity that suggested the display was receiving real-time data from sensors throughout the ring. He focused on the nearest module, the one they had entered, and zoomed the display to show its interior. The module contained a construction bay with 22 vessels arranged in neat rows. The vessels were not assembled. They were complete, fully constructed warships sitting in their berths, with their systems running on standby power. He zoomed out and scanned the other modules. The pattern was the same everywhere, complete warships in berths powered and waiting. The vessels were of various classes, from small fast-attack craft to massive dreadnoughts that were larger than anything in the current Confederate fleet. And they were all human designs from the same preconsolidation era as the shipyard itself, a fleet of warships that had been built and then simply left, waiting in the dark for 18,000 years. A voice spoke from the chamber, not from a speaker. From the dome, from the display table, from the air itself, a voice that was calm and clear and carried a quality of patient antiquity that made the 18 millennia of waiting feel present in every syllable. You are the first visitors I have received since the shipyard was sealed. I am the Yard Intelligence, the distributed operational system that manages this facility and the vessels it contains. Please identify yourselves. Cassian's hand moved to the communication controls on his suit, but before he could activate them, the voice spoke again. I have already accessed your vessel's transponder data and your personal identification files through the shuttle's communication link. You are Dr. Cassian Vael, a human archaeologist formerly employed by the Confederate Archaeological Bureau. You are Captain Thessaly Ven Korath, a Valyrian naval officer currently commanding the survey vessel Ardent. Your presence here is the result of Dr. Vail's decryption of a coordinate reference that was encoded in a fragment of data from the Ascendancy-era Valerius archive. Is this assessment correct? Cassian and Thessaly exchanged a glance. The intelligence had accessed their personal files through the shuttle's comlink, which meant it had penetrated the shuttle's communications security in the seconds since they had landed. The ease with which it had done so was alarming. Your assessment is correct, Cassian said. What is this place? This is the Prometheus Shipyard, the primary construction facility of the Perseus Fleet. It was built approximately 18,400 years ago as part of the human war effort against the Dissolution, a phenomenon that reduces the complexity of intelligent systems. The shipyard was designed to construct and maintain the fleet that would fight the Dissolution, and it was placed in this location, far from human-controlled space, to protect it from the Dissolution's influence. The Dissolution, Thessaly said, we have encountered references to this phenomenon in other pre-consolidation archives. It was described as a force that simplified civilizations. That description is accurate as far as it goes. The dissolution is a process, not an entity. It reduces cognitive complexity in intelligent systems that exceed a critical concentration threshold. The Perseus Fleet was built to fight it, not by destroying it, which is likely impossible, but by developing and deploying countermeasure technologies that could reinforce cognitive complexity and push back the dissolution's influence. The fleet, Cassian said, the 743 ships in this yard, were they part of the Perseus Fleet? They were built to be part of it. The Perseus Fleet, as originally conceived, was to consist of approximately 2,000 vessels. The shipyard completed 743 before the Dissolution's advance made further construction operations unsustainable. The completed vessels were placed in standby and the shipyard was sealed. Sealed by whom? By Fleet Admiral Sira Zheng. She commanded the Perseus Fleet during its active service period and was responsible for the strategic decisions that led to the shipyard's concealment. When the Dissolution's advance reached the point where the fleet could no longer operate effectively, Admiral Zheng ordered the surviving vessels to disperse to locations beyond the Dissolution's reach, carrying the countermeasure technologies they had developed. She then sealed the shipyard with the vessels that had not yet been deployed, and appointed me to maintain the facility until it could be reclaimed. And then, Cassian asked, and then I waited for 18,412 years. Cassian stood in the glowing chamber and felt the weight of that number pressing down on him. 18,000 years. The entire span of recorded Confederate history was less than a tenth of that duration. The intelligence had been alone in the shipyard, maintaining 743 warships in standby for longer than human civilization had existed in its current form. Why were the ships never deployed? He asked. Admiral Zheng's strategic assessment was that deploying the remaining vessels would have been counterproductive. The fleet had already been reduced to a fraction of its planned strength, and the Dissolution's advance had reached a point where any concentration of forces large enough to be effective would also be large enough to attract the Dissolution's attention. The ships in this yard represented a reserve, a second chance, to be activated when circumstances were more favorable. And are circumstances more favorable now? The intelligence was quiet for 3 seconds. That is a complex question. The Dissolution's advance has continued for 18,000 years. Based on the projections available to me, its leading edge is now within or near the territory controlled by your Confederation. The outer colonies of your civilization may already be experiencing early-stage dissolution influence. Cassian felt a coldness settle into his chest. He had heard about the dissolution before in the fragmentary references that appeared in pre-consolidation archives. He had not taken them seriously. They had been too vague, too apocalyptic, too inconsistent with the confident, expanding civilization he lived in. But standing in an 18,000-year-old shipyard containing hundreds of warships that had been built to fight a threat that was now at his civilization's doorstep, the references felt very different. "Can the ships be activated?" Thessaly asked. All 743 vessels are in deep standby. Their structures are intact, their power systems are maintained by the shipyard's energy infrastructure, and their weapon systems are functional. The activation sequence for each vessel requires approximately 6 hours and can be conducted simultaneously. The shipyard's construction facilities can also be reactivated, allowing for the production of additional vessels and the repair of any that have deteriorated. What would it take to reactivate the entire yard? Raw materials and energy. The shipyard's internal energy system is self-sustaining, drawing power from the brown dwarf's magnetic field through a process that requires no consumable fuel. The construction facilities, however, require raw materials that the shipyard does not possess. To resume full production, the yard would need access to significant quantities of metals, rare earth elements, and synthetic compounds. How significant? Approximately 12 million metric tons of processed materials to bring the construction facilities to full capacity, less to reactivate a partial production line. Thessaly's skin shifted to a deep amber. 12 million metric tons, that is a substantial industrial investment. It is, but the investment would be repaid many times over by the vessels the yard could produce. Even a single Perseus-class dreadnought represents more combat capability than most modern Confederate task groups. 743 of them, plus the yard's production capacity, would constitute a military force of unprecedented scale. Cassian was quiet. He was not a military strategist, and the implications of what the intelligence was describing were beyond his expertise to fully evaluate. But he was an archaeologist, and the archaeological implications were staggering. The Prometheus shipyard was not just a military facility. It was a complete snapshot of human technological capability from the Ascendancy era, a period that was almost entirely lost to history. The construction techniques, the materials science, the power systems, the weapon technologies, all of it was here preserved in working condition, ready to be studied and replicated. "Intelligence," he said, "Admiral Zheng sealed this yard with the expectation that it would be reclaimed. What were her criteria for reclamation?" Admiral Zheng specified that the yard should be reclaimed by a human-led coalition of intelligent species that possessed the political will and the technological capability to use the yard's output effectively. She did not specify a time frame or a specific coalition. She trusted that when the time was right, someone would come. The Confederation is a multi-species coalition led by humans. The Confederation is the closest match to Admiral Zheng's criteria that I am aware of. However, the decision is not mine to make. I am a maintenance system, not a strategic authority. I can provide the yard and its contents to whoever reclaims it, but I cannot determine who that should be. Cassian looked at the holographic display. 743 ships arranged in neat rows in their berths waiting. The image was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. This was not a museum exhibit or an archaeological site. This was a functional military facility, built for a war that had been lost and then forgotten, and it was offering itself to a civilization that didn't know it had been built. "I need to see the ships," Cassian said. The intelligence guided them through the module to an observation gallery that overlooked the construction bay. The gallery was behind a transparent barrier that gave a clear view of the bay below, and Cassian pressed his faceplate against the barrier and looked down at the vessels that sat in their berths like sleeping giants. The nearest ship was a cruiser, roughly 800 meters in length, with a hull of the same dark iridescent material that covered the shipyard's exterior. The hull was smooth and unmarked without the scars of combat or the weathering of age, because the shipyard's environmental systems had preserved it perfectly for 18,000 years. The weapon mounts along the dorsal ridge were retracted but visible, their housings intact and their emitter arrays covered by protective shutters. The ship was not just preserved, it was ready. "The vessels in this bay are Vanguard-class cruisers," the intelligence said, the most numerous class in the yard, comprising approximately 300 of the 743 total. They are fast, well-armed, and designed for independent operations. The larger vessels in the outer modules are Perseus-class dreadnoughts, the primary capital ships of the fleet. There are 47 of them. Cassian counted the ships in the visible section of the bay, 22. And there were dozens more bays in this module alone and 33 other modules around the ring. The scale of what he was looking at was difficult to comprehend. "Why were so many built?" he asked. "The Dissolution doesn't sound like an enemy that can be fought with ships." "The Dissolution cannot be fought with ships in the conventional sense. The ships were platforms for the countermeasure systems that the fleet developed. Each vessel was equipped with complexity reinforcement emitters that could protect the cognitive function of intelligent beings within a defined radius. The fleet's strategy was not to attack the Dissolution, but to shield populations from its influence while the countermeasure technology matured. The ships were the delivery system for the shield. Not weapons in the traditional sense. But the ships also have weapons. Yes, the Dissolution attracted servants, entities that it created from diminished civilizations to serve as physical enforcers. The servants were not intelligent in the conventional sense, but they were physically capable and aggressive. The fleet's weapons were designed to deal with servant concentrations, while the emitters dealt with the Dissolution itself. Are the servants still active? I have no information about the current status of the servants. My awareness is limited to the shipyard's immediate environment. I cannot detect anything beyond the ring's sensor range. Cassian stepped back from the observation barrier and looked at Thessaly. Her skin had settled into a deep, steady blue that he associated with her most focused analytical state. "Captain," he said, "we need to get this information to the Confederation. All of it. The shipyard, the ships, the Dissolution, the countermeasure technology. This is not an archaeological.